The Egypt Game. Neferbeth. Near the end of September, a new girl moved into the Casa Rosada. Her name was Elizabeth Chung. She and her mother and two little sisters had rented the little semi-basement apartment next to where Mr. Bodler, the janitor, lived. Caroline went down to call on Mrs. Chung the evening the family moved in to see if there was anything she could do to help them get settled. She asked April if she wanted to go along to meet Elizabeth, but April said, "No, thanks." When her grandmother came back upstairs, April found out all about the new family. Mr. Chung had died recently, and his wife was going to have to get a job to support her three little girls. She had moved to the Casa Rosada because it was only a few blocks from where her parents lived. Mrs. Chung's mother was going to take care of the two smallest girls while she was at work. "Elizabeth is only a little younger than you and Melanie," Caroline said. "Perhaps you could ask her to play with you. She's probably feeling lonely and worried about starting in at a new school." April was ambushed by a quick pang of sympathy, remembering how it was, missing someone and having to face a new classroom. But she pulled herself together and shook it off. It occurred to her that Caroline ought to know that you didn't pick your friends just because they were handy or even lonely. You picked them because you thought alike and were interested in the same things, the way she and Melanie were. "How old is she?" she asked, letting her eyes go narrow. "I think her mother said she was 9, Caroline said. 9, said April with a cool smile, "is a lot younger than 11. "Well, of course, it will have to be up to you and Melanie to decide," Caroline said calmly. But as she turned to leave the room, April was sure she heard a rather exasperated sigh. April tried to feel pleased about the sigh, but something prickled uncomfortably. She decided she didn't want to think about it. She called to Caroline that she was going down to talk to Melanie. Melanie would understand how impossible it would be to invite someone else to be part of anything so private and secret as the Egypt Game. Mr. Ross called, "Come in," when April knocked. He was sitting on the couch, surrounded by books and papers. He was studying to be a college teacher, and he always had a lot of work to do in the evenings. He was a big man with dark brown skin and a teasing smile. He was always kidding April about her name. When April opened the door, he said, "Just as I thought, it's springtime. Melanie, the cruelest month is here." Mr. Ross was going to teach things like poetry and literature, and he was always making jokes that weren't very funny, unless you knew what he was talking about. That cruelest month business, for instance, was something he was always kidding April about. It didn't make any sense to April until Melanie found out about it and explained. It seemed it came from a big, long poem that started out about how April was the cruelest month. April still didn't think it was any riot, but she guessed it was okay for that kind of joke. As soon as the girls were alone in Melanie's room, April brought up the subject of Elizabeth. Sure enough, Melanie's mother had been after her too, to make the new girl feel at home. "I don't know what they think we can do," April said. "We can't let her in on the Egypt Game. She'd be sure to think about it and ruin everything." "Well, we'll have to get to know her first," Melanie said, "and see if she's the kind who can keep a secret. And then—" "Keep a secret?" April interrupted scornfully. "For one thing, she's only 9 years old." "Well, Marshall's only 4, Melanie said, "and he doesn't ever think." "Marshall's different," April said impatiently. "This Elizabeth is probably just like any other blabbermouth 4th grader." Alarmed at what seemed to be a rather wishy-washy attitude on Melanie's part, April didn't go home until she felt sure they had reached a firm decision. No matter what, no new girl was going to be let in on the Egypt Game. If they asked Elizabeth to walk to school with them, and maybe talk to her at recess for a while until she got around to making 4th grade friends, that would be enough. The next morning, April and Melanie went dutifully down the little dark basement hallway and knocked on the door of the Chung's apartment. Almost immediately, the door across the hall opened, and Mr. Bodler, the janitor, looked out. "Oh, hello there, young ladies," he said. "Thought I heard someone knocking on my door." "Hello, Mr. Bodler," Melanie said. "We've come to get the new girl and take her to school with us." "Well, now, isn't that nice? I think that's right nice of you young ladies." April and Melanie turned back to the Chung's door, but Mr. Bodler went on standing behind them. They exchanged sideways, wouldn't you know it, glances. Mr. Bodler was a fattish man with faded blonde hair who was always nosily cheerful at children. The situation was already uncomfortable, and Mr. Bodler, who was a naturally uncomfortable person to be around, wasn't making it any better. The door of the Chung's apartment was finally opened by a very small Asian girl. "Hi," April said. "Is your big sister ready to go to school? We've come to take her." The girl smiled shyly. "I'm Elizabeth," she said. On the way to school, Elizabeth walked between April and Melanie. She really was amazingly tiny for a fourth grader. Her thick black hair was pulled back into a carefully curled ponytail that bounced when she walked, and there was something about the carved perfection of her face that made her smile seem like magic. An enchanted ivory princess, warmingly suddenly to light. She was shy, but not in the stiff, embarrassing way that makes other people feel embarrassed too. It was a gentle, friendly shyness that made other people feel important, sort of in charge of things. April had been afraid, well, looking at Elizabeth's upturned face and pretty tilted eyes, wide with wonder at almost anything you told her. It was hard to remember just what she was afraid of. She almost wished she hadn't been so convincing when she talked to Melanie the night before about how they didn't want anybody else butting into their friendship. By the time April and Melanie delivered Elizabeth to the door of the fourth grade room, they had completely forgotten that taking care of Elizabeth had been anybody's idea but their own. Melanie's forehead wrinkled with worry as she watched Elizabeth make her way timidly through the noisily assembling fourth graders to the teacher's desk, and a couple of boys who were saying, "Hey, look at the new girl," and "Ugh, a girl," and other typically fourth grade remarks were suddenly silenced when they met April's ferocious glare. That afternoon, April and Melanie walked Elizabeth home, and by the next morning they were both wondering if it wouldn't be all right, after all, to let her join the Egypt game. But it was a touchy sort of thing to bring up, not knowing for sure how the other one felt about it. And then a very strange thing happened. Elizabeth had arranged to meet them that morning on the front steps of the Casa Rosada, and when April and Melanie were crossing the lobby, they could see her through the glass of the front door. She was sitting on the railing and looking off up Orchard Avenue, so her profile was towards them. All of a sudden, April grabbed Melanie's arm. "Look," she whispered. "What?" Melanie whispered back. "Elizabeth," April said. "Who does she look like?" Melanie caught her breath. "Nefertiti," she breathed. Sure enough, Elizabeth's ponytail pulled her hair back away from her face and neck, and there was certainly something about her delicate, slender-necked profile that was very like the statue of Nefertiti. Of course, Elizabeth's nose was a tiny bit shorter, and maybe her chin a little rounder, but the resemblance was there just the same. She saw them then and bounced through the door to meet them before anything more could be said. But it wasn't really necessary. April and Melanie just looked at each other and nodded, and on the way to school they started telling Elizabeth all about the Egypt game.